One part of the prayer release calls us to pray to empower bishops to hold all Christian leaders accountable to their holy calling and to respond with grace and generosity to those who have been wounded by the church. These 4 bishops have agreed to share with us a little bit about how they do that, about how they are responding with grace and generosity. They will be talking about ways of prevention, of intervention, of response, of healing and restoration. When they have finished sharing, the microphones are in the aisle, and we will invite you to come and make comments or ask questions and be in conversation together. And Bishop Dick, I believe you are ready to start.
Right. Thank you. In the Divine Hours that I use by Phyllis Tickle, one of the prayers for today had something, I'm not sure I can quote it exactly, but it's from China, and it says, "Give me the magnanimity of spirit and the faithfulness that someday the Lord won't say, 'This is my body broken by you.'" And that's a prayer I often think about, particularly in any of our responsibilities and as the church, that what we do does not break the body of Christ. We've been asked actually to talk about the partnerships and the interactions between the various ways in which we care for the body of Christ around misconduct, specifically of the sexual nature. And this is not a tried and true metaphor. There's always downsides to a metaphor, but we kind of decided that we would start with the metaphor of what we understand as care. And so if you want to go ahead with the first part of that, you know, when there's risk management, and risk management is, for most of us, the boundary training. How many of you are involved in some aspect of boundary training? Yeah, pretty many of you are involved in that. And so over time, I've also sort of gotten the sense already that many of our annual conferences are kind of revamping their boundary training. This field is changing constantly. And so we're talking about different ways of helping our boundary training to look at the variety of things besides what, for lack of a better term, the most egregious. And because I've always found that there's a lot of crossing of boundaries, maybe smaller boundaries, you know, nothing that in and of themselves would maybe get somebody into huge trouble, but there's been a lot of crossing of boundaries you discover before there is more egregious and damaging things. And so we're constantly working on risk management to prevent something from happening. But something often happens. And that is a variety of degrees of egregiousness, and then you have to deal with something. So the image that I often use, I use this for counseling sometimes too, but the image I think of, and it helps me to remember my role and also the interactions or communications, is the first ones in, the first responders is really like the ambulance. So the ambulance comes. The ambulance is really like the call to the district superintendent or the bishop's office. And, you know, it's a critical situation. You may not always even know what you're dealing with. It's highly emotional. You have to respond quickly. And it begins to often get very complicated. And in the midst of that, now this is the part that I confess I have to be really clear of. We're in we're in the ambulance situation. Now, if Representative Giffords, I'm sure that everybody, when she was in the ambulance, everybody wanted to know, when will she go back to work? What will be the damage here? How long will it take? What will, you know, the people in the ambulance, they may have had the same questions, but those were not the questions they could answer at that point. And I find that in the midst of really just trying to deal with this situation in the first couple of days, you're in this ambulance metaphor of just trying to figure out what's going on and just get them to better care. So after a while, after a few days, maybe a week or so, there's the opportunity to look at the the various players in that. It can be the clergy person, the staff parish relations committee, the church itself, the community, even the media with disclosure, and sometimes even colleagues. You're just trying to figure out what's going on here. Until, this is when we begin particularly some of the interactions or partnerships, until you actually begin to develop a plan of care. So the district superintendent, the bishops, those who are immediately involved, in a sense, you take them to ICU, to the critical care. And you begin to bring others into the situation. So when an ambulance takes somebody to the hospital, you don't just drop them off at the doorstep and roar on, right? I don't think so. You give a little bit of what's gone on. You give some vital statistics here that they need to know. And you begin to bring in, in our situation, the response team. You begin to work on letters of disclosure to the congregation so that the congregation knows what's going on. And you continue, of course, to develop some kind of care program for all of those involved. But it's still a pretty critical situation. You still may not know what outcomes might be. As you begin to work those, it's a little bit like the step down or the regular floor of a hospital, and you begin to allow for some of the healing to take place. This can last a pretty long time. And it continues to be working out some of the things that the response team has been able to do. They may come back into a congregation and to work, but it takes time to be able to work on those particular aspects. But then I'd also like to keep in mind, and I think this has been one of the areas of, probably the greatest frustration and feeling like sometimes they just can't do enough, and that's really rehabilitation for the congregation in particular. How do we bring healing? There's also the restorative aspect for those who have suffered directly from this. But sometimes I think that the congregation has also been overlooked in the past. And so in our conference, where we apply resources really is in after pastors, or as we sometimes rather call them, after churches, where they need a care. If, unfortunately, we have more than maybe 2 or 3, we actually have a group that meets on a regular basis with a professional that we have nearby. And there's an ongoing consultative work that goes on with the person, either the interim or the next appointed pastor, so that that congregation as well as that pastor are continuing to heal. Because I think one of the disconnects that has happened, at least in my experience, is the ongoing care for that church. It's just not over. In fact, it's not over for a very, very long time, as most of you know. And so, one of the things that in our annual conference in Minnesota we've tried to do is really to come full circle. And that is to have a debriefing following some critical incidents, and to bring back representatives of the response team, the cabinet, the bishop, and other critical players in the care of that situation. And that's where we've found most of the opportunities to really rethink our risk management from the perspective of each one of those aspects or those stages of caring for the people involved. And it helps us to better understand what kinds of communications people need, because you can't just tell the whole story to everybody. Confidentiality is often a problem in that regard. But it helps us to fully understand from various players' perspectives what we need to do better. I know every time one of these situations happens, I learn something. I feel like I take one step, maybe even inch forward, and I'm even a little bit embarrassed about how I did it last time now that I have this one different perspective. But I think that's the way to be. And so we just keep giving back that feedback in a debriefing situation so that we can provide better care to all of those involved in the various stages, including the people who are the responders, the district superintendents, the response team. We should never forget the toll that it takes on those persons as well.
Well, I'll go next and share a little bit, if I may. I thought Sally was going to use a little different image to start out with, so I wanted to use one that I picked up from where I thought she was going earlier in the process, and it is a medical kind of analogy, and so don't push it too far, but use it as a helpful instrument, and that would be to say that there is the kind of what I refer to as preventable treatment that you go through, that you're trying to prevent disease from occurring and to live a healthy life, and that would and be reflected in the kind of safe sanctuary training that goes on all the way from the training of pastors in terms of sexual ethics and the background that's there, but also making sure that those two are working in harmony with each other in order that when the preventive training is given, it is given in such a way that pastors understand what are the appropriate boundaries and how to bring that into the total life of the church, as well for their own ongoing ministry, as well as the aspect of ongoing ministry of the congregation. There is that time of illness that occurs. Sally referred that to explosion, probably a very apt description of what occurs. I would say that's when a person enters into the hospital, and triage is the kind of image that when you get to that point, you have people that are trying to evaluate very quickly what to do first, because you can't do everything, but there's some things if you don't do, you can cause greater harm in the process. And so it becomes that element of trying to determine, is this the point that suspension needs to occur, when there needs to be time out for all the parties to have a point just to look and to search and to determine what's best to move forward, and how we go about that in an appropriate fashion. In our annual conference, that's very often the point when we rely significantly upon superintendents to be able to look and to remain somewhat detached sufficiently to evaluate and not get drawn into the emergency situation or the triage where they cannot appropriately know what to do and how to go about that effectively. And then if you move on to that kind of critical care in the life of the church, and we have developed where we have a few individuals, and fortunately have only needed a few individuals that can come in and to provide that interim kind of pastoral situation, which is extremely critical. Most of the time, that's the ability to love and to care for all of the people of the congregation, because there has been significant harm that has occurred, not just to one or two people, but to lots of people in the church. The trust has been broken, relationships are broken, and if not careful, what you see is that the congregation can very quickly divide into various camps of support and help for one person or another person, and greater harm can occur. And so it becomes critical to begin to treat in an appropriate fashion and utilization then of interim leadership in terms of bringing that about. It's also the point in which we utilize some specialists to come in, especially in working with individuals, providing some advocacy at times, standing alongside, providing support and help in that process, and the offering then of appropriate counseling to assist that they can begin to move toward health in that process. And then hopefully we're able to move beyond that into the appointment of pastoral leadership for that congregation that is appropriate. I have to admit, I really appreciated the kind of debriefing you discussed. That's not something we have done. I'll take that one home with me in terms of bringing the folks together to help us learn from what has occurred. Have done that in terms of cabinet members and the kind of conversation that go on there. But I think that what I've heard you say lends itself to much better process as we have to go through another case that maybe have some similarity, although my experience says they're never the same. They're all different. And when you think, I've got this down, I know what I'll do next time, the person that comes in to triage doesn't look like the person that came in before. They do not have the same symptoms, and it's almost like starting all over again in that process.
This whole image of this medical image that Sally presented for us, it strikes me that when I think about the process that I've experienced it in South Carolina, that one piece of that is that when you check in that hospital, one of the things they ask you about is whether you have a living will. And, you know, they ask you, are you an organ donor? And when they ask that, you respond as you do, but there's always a sense that it won't come to that. It won't come to that. When I received my first complaint against a clergy in South Carolina, and I had some conversation with some retired bishops in the college, and what they said was, "This is the process that you do, Dindy." I said, "Well, what about the possibility of a trial?" "Oh, it won't come to that."
How'd that work for you?
And the reality is, it does come to that. And everything about in a perfect world where people are repentive, when you can work with something, you are in one place. But the reality I've found is that you do not always find yourself in that place. And so everything you do from the very first phone call or meeting with that person who brings a complaint has to be documented, and you walk through it, and there is the possibility that the end of that may be a trial where everything you do will be scrutinized, where your intentions, where your reasoning for doing whatever you've done will be questioned. Motives I never would have thought I was capable of, I have been accused of. So sometimes it comes to that. Now, also in the medical model, it strikes me that there's a lot of question of how the community understands their hospital. and the kind of trust they place in the hospital. And what I discovered was that in South Carolina, the sterile environment had been contaminated. That several years before, there had been a trial where the way it was conducted, there was a majority of the evidence on the side of counsel for the church, which was omitted, which by the presiding bishop for whatever reason. And so then that person was found not guilty. So then as you get in this process, someone very easily says, fine, I'll take my chances with the trial. So one wise person in South Carolina shared with me that sometimes you have to do a trial to prove you'll do one. And so I just kind of share that as a concern. One of the things that it's so obvious when you get into this process that even though some people think that everything for good or ill is the bishop's responsibility and fault, the reality is that there are so many people in the process that you partner with that allow the environment to be one that you can find a way forward for all involved. The image I thought of was when I was a little kid, it was a long time ago. Maybe it was a college kid, but when you do an egg toss, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Where you have a raw egg and you throw it to somebody, and the more time, eventually that egg is going to break. And the more times you throw it, it might get some little hairline cracks. You know, it might break the first time, but gradually, as it's tossed off again and again and again, it's going to break. And it strikes me that sometimes that is the complainant. And rather than, as we pass that off to various groups who by our disciplinary procedure have to hear the story again, have to bring the questions again, that sometimes that fragile individual becomes closer and closer to breaking. And how can you help that not happen? You're very careful as you pass it off. You're very careful on the persons that you have interact with that person. And if you do, and it does come to that, and you select counsel for the church, you get someone who is going to be very caring and sensitive. So we've had many complaints. We've had 3 that actually have gone to trial, and it's never going to come to that. But I'll just tell you that it does. It does.
Good.
I also have taken the position that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so in Holston, we talk a little bit more about how we can position our pastors to be empowered to not only read situations, but understand their role as those situations develop. In so doing, we take the position that no one within their right frame of reference would want to be a respondent, whether they are guilty or innocent. No one wants to be in that position. So what we try to do is try to help our pastors to never get there. We have in Holston, as a part of what we call our first-time appointees, all of those first-time appointees must begin that with sexual ethics training. That must happen before they actually begin to function in the pastoral relationship, because we do believe that the prevention is more important than the cure. And sometimes, unfortunately, though, even as much as you try to do, those things do happen. So far, unlike Bishop Taylor, during my 6 years, we have not gone to trial. Now, that has nothing to do with James Swanson. That's the grace of God that we've been able to move in that direction. But I do believe that we would do ourselves much more to not only do things like sexual ethics training and first-time appointees, but also to be in conversations with our boards of ordained ministry around their role in helping us to ferret out persons who very early on could begin to show possibilities of not being able to keep boundaries, and to get that information as early as we can to make sure that we do not release someone onto a church and therefore never have to go and put someone through an ambulance or triage. So my thing is to do the preventive part. But when something of that nature happens, we spend a great deal of time in the investigative role. I have found that I would rather run the risk of even being one who might transgress against these 60-day rules or 90-day rules to make sure I have the proper, I've taken the proper time to do what needs to be done, and to be patient as we do that is over against a sort of rush to not only judgment, but a rush to resolution. And I found that in doing that and in being in constant dialogue, not only with, but with the complainant, usually you can find your way forward. I found when you give people the time, they can help you with their own healing if you allow them, and if you learn how to be active listeners. And so the superintendents try to model that. I have taken the position as a bishop that I try in the early stages of this not to be actively involved. I spend my time more in the background trying to counsel my superintendents as they move through that, and trying to equip them and to also be sort of a reflector as they have conversations, to help them to hear what is going on in those conversations, as over against getting involved too early on in the process and thereby running the risk of being prejudiced against or for. And so what I try to do is just listen, and to be one who reflects. I try to keep our conference chancellor involved because of just the whole probability of putting the whole annual conference at risk as we go forward. So I have to do those kinds of things as well. We've also taken the position in a sort of an active way, proactive way, that we also discovered that in many annual conferences, there have not been proper training for administrative review committees that would help us to follow those kinds of processes. The investigation committee has not been properly trained. You'd be surprised if you check your annual conference to find out whether or not any training has been provided. Has any training been provided for persons to equip them to be the counsel for the church? You know, in many instances, there are no people who have been properly trained for that. You sort of assume that has been done, and I would say that you don't assume that, to check to make sure that you have those people in place so that if it gets to the point where it's threatened to go to trial, that you have people who can step in and the bishop can hand that off to someone who is capable of moving forward as far as the church is concerned. We also do, we've taken our Safe Sanctuaries training a little step further, in that we're not only, our sexual ethics training a little step further, and not only just doing clergy, but we're also making ourselves available, particularly for some of our large churches, to do sexual ethics training with their staff, because in many instances the staff do not have that training. Since being here, I'm really beginning to rethink something else as well, and that is, how can we provide some kind of sexual ethics training for the whole local church, but in particular the staff parish committees as they work through it. Because one of the things that I discovered very early on was the fact that no matter how firm you are in saying that the church will not tolerate this, you have to understand and know that in particular churches, sometimes that develops almost a kind of idolatrous relationship between pastors and parishioners, to the point where the parishioners will almost crucify you when you come in to try to correct that kind of situation. And so some teaching that needs to happen to help congregations be prepared in case a much beloved pastor also sins. And how does the church handle that? I'm really, my very first situation ran into that and realized very early on that I had to do that. The other piece that I found out too is particularly around helping the superintendents understand the importance of records. I'm just telling you, I was really appalled when we began to look in people's files and the rumor mill was out there that this has happened before, but there was nothing in the records at all. Nothing had been written up. Nothing had been said about it. And so we're very careful about making sure that we maintain records, because in many instances, you need to be able to show a pattern. And if you don't have that, you put the complainant, particularly at a great deal of risk. And so trying to do that as well to help your superintendents to learn how to keep proper records. We also discovered something else we were doing, and then I'll open the floor because I know you all want to interact with us. But sometimes conferences may make the mistake that I think we made in Holston, particularly around the use of a conference counselor. We discovered that you put your conference counselor sometime at a great deal of risk when you're using them, particularly in these kinds of cases, because what happened for us is that we found out as we made a referral that the counselor had already been in a relationship with the respondent. And so we have now placed, in a sense, have two people who are sort of on retainers, or who at least know they may get a call from the bishop from time to time to refer those persons, so that the conference counselor is not put in the position of having to try to be objective when they can't be, because they already have a relationship. So you need to be very careful about the use of the conference counselor. The last part of that that taught me was the fact that you need to make funds available in your annual conference to be able to do the work that needs to be done, and not allow the conference budget to limit that. We've also had some conversations about how long do we pay for the ongoing healing of the complainant. And so those kinds of things is kind of where we are in Holston. I too will take back the whole idea that Bishop Dick brought up of having sort of a debriefing so that we can all learn from what we've done so that we can do it better. We are human beings, and we should be learning individuals, and each time we do it, we can find something that will help us do a better job.